Hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Director of Communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham, and the political correspondent for the Financial Times, Laura Hughes. Well, let's have a look at what's on some of those front pages. The Daily Telegraph leads with Ukraine. Its headline, "The PM urges Russia to step back from brink." The Express uses this same quote in its headline to look at what they're calling the Prime Minister's diplomatic dash to Europe. Scholz plans fresh Ukraine talks as West steps up evacuations is on the front of the Financial Times as they look at Germany's response to the crisis. The Metro also leads with this story. Its headline, "West can't Vladimir Putin." In other news, The National quotes Ian Blackford, who describes Boris Johnson's imminent trip to Scotland as a farewell tour. And The Guardian looks at calls for radical action after a race report into Britain's public health service finds gross failings in the NHS. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. We're joined, as I said, tonight by Annabel Denham and Laura Hughes. Let's get straight into the papers. Good evening to you both. Thanks for being with us. I want to start with the FT, and on its front page, Scholz plans fresh Ukraine talks as West steps up evacuations. One line here that I picked out, this coming from the German Chancellor. "I don't assume we'll come out of this with some kind of concrete result," he said, but he insisted that now is not the time for resignation. I wonder, Laura, if you think that sort of sums up the situation in that there is this desperate attempt for diplomacy without much hope that it's going to break through.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And also the point worth making is that Germany, of course, is really reliant on Russia in terms of the energy it gets. And there has been some criticism in Whitehall from British diplomats that maybe the French in particular and slightly the Germans have been a little bit more softly spoken in their dealings with the Russians. But of course, Germany, I think tomorrow is going to try and step up the rhetoric and play hardball, given the situation and given the fact that you have seen this massive diplomatic blitz from the Americans, the Brits, the French, everyone basically trying to talk Putin down the ladder. And this is just the latest attempt, really. And I think it reflects how deeply concerned European allies and NATO are about Putin and his ambitions.
Deeply concerned and until now not looking very united in their reaction to this crisis. Annabel, the Daily Telegraph has on its front page, so PM urges Russia to step back from the brink is the headline, with Johnson, of course, beginning this last-ditch round of diplomacy, as they call it. They quote a Russian ambassador saying, and I can't actually say the words, so I'll say, "We don't give a bleep about sanctions," is what he says. I wonder if, is that the issue here, is that it doesn't really matter what the West does now in terms of sanctions. It's not going to be enough to deter Putin if he does want to invade, which, of course, we don't know if he does.
Yes, absolutely. I think that Ukraine has always been of greater geopolitical significance to Russia than it has to the Western alliance. And this is the corner that the West have backed themselves into. We are entering into a fight and we're not really willing to follow through. I mean, all of the front pages really are underscoring the immense amount of uncertainty with the situation in Ukraine. We still don't know what's going to happen. There's still a strong sense, as there has been for many weeks, that the coming days are critical. We're going to see more saber rattling. We're going to see more rhetoric, perhaps with expletives, perhaps not, more efforts at diplomacy, parties backing themselves into ever tighter corners. And you know, in my view, it'll just become ever clearer that the only realistic option for the West, for NATO, for Europe, for the UK and the US are economic sanctions. And we can impose pretty severe financial sanctions on Russia. But there's a risk that either they backfire and they have implications for our own economies, or they push Russia towards an invasion. So, we're treading on very thin ice here. We simply don't know what's going to happen. Where a couple of weeks ago I might have said that there was about a 50-50 chance of an incursion, I think that's increased in the last fortnight or so. I think we're probably looking at close to a probability of 2 to 1. But don't hold me to that. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, it's hard to hold anyone to any of these predictions at the moment. Laura, I wonder if you'd stick your neck out and make a prediction like that, bearing in mind, for example, that on the front page of The Guardian, leave now, Western diplomats flee Kiev. This idea that the US and the UK certainly are removing their diplomatic staff. I mean, does that suggest an invasion is more likely now?
I think what that reflects is that we're only 6 months since Kabul and the evacuation there, and I don't think anybody expected Afghanistan to fall to the Taliban as quickly as it did. And that was an incredibly humiliating moment. I think overall, Putin saw what happened in Afghanistan, saw what he perceived to be the Western's disinterest in engaging in foreign conflict or overseas affairs, and has potentially sought to exploit that. So I think the urgency with which we are withdrawing our diplomats from Ukraine reflects the fact that we're sharing a lot of intelligence with the Americans. We're very much aligned with them. I think the Brits are seeing this whole crisis as an opportunity to show the US President Biden that we are still his number one ally in Europe. I think before he came in, he thought Macron might be. So I think it reflects us wanting to do whatever the Americans do, and also just a worry of any sort of repetition from what we saw happen in Afghanistan and Kabul. And the Observer sort of touches on that on their front page going into tomorrow. It's so hard to know. I think, the Americans are clear that something could happen within a couple of days, but truly nobody knows. And there was a very interesting tweet from the Russian embassy I saw in the last 24 hours where they suggested that if they were to back down, the West would seize it as a diplomatic victory and it would be spun back here as a massive success, which I thought was interesting. Were they hinting that maybe they were prepared to take a step back? The honest truth is nobody knows, and everybody's incredibly nervous and very worried and watching. And I think there is a sense that it's better just to get people out in case something goes wrong. But also, it's been really interesting to look at different media outlets talking to people actually living in Ukraine over the weekend, many of whom are going about their business as normal and who don't feel any need to panic. And I think some of the Ukrainian politicians have also suggested everyone is being a little bit too hysterical and needs to not panic because that's just provoking the Russians. But honestly, it's hard to say. Clearly, Western intelligence is such that there are real fears something could happen within the next few days.
And it is, you touched on it there, but it is always very interesting to see how this is being reported by the Russian media, certainly, because we talk about it in one sense, but there is, of course, the Russian side of this story. We're moving away from Ukraine now. We're going to look at a few other stories, certainly closer to home. Let's start with The National, the Scottish paper. And Laura, one for you here. PM's visit a farewell tour, says Ian Blackford. A walking advert for Indie. This all part of the Prime Minister's tour around the UK, trying to sell his levelling up agenda and hopefully distract from the Partygate stuff that's going on at home. Given what Ian Blackford's saying there, does that just show the scale of the task he has ahead of him?
Yes, and I think it's not a coincidence that one of the first places he would go during parliamentary recess is Scotland, because the union is in real trouble, according to those sort of around Boris Johnson at the moment. They know that they have a huge problem. One glaring one is the fact that the Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, has actually called for the Prime Minister to resign in recent weeks over the Partygate allegation. So that's deeply embarrassing for Boris Johnson. And I think reports have said that he will be avoiding the Scottish Tory leader, which is, again, very, very bizarre. And we had Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former leader of the Commons, dismissing Douglas Ross as a sort of insignificant figure, which, again, was really uncomfortable and angered a lot of backbench Tory MPs who are deeply concerned that the Scottish population are becoming increasingly alienated with the government in London. And Ian Blackford there talking about another vote of independence, another opportunity or chance or calls to break away from England. And he's going to have quite a big task on his hands. And yeah, I don't know whether it is easier to go on this tour of Europe and try and dissuade Russia from invading Ukraine, because he really does have his own battlefront back home that he's going to have to deal with.
Yes, certainly. And I wonder, Annabel, what you make of with this new plan from the government. They're talking about their slimmed down, trying to reduce the size of government, trying to obviously move the focus from the crises that they've been jumping between to actually the job that they're there to do, which is to govern the country. Do you like the plan?
Well, anything that slims down the size of the government gets my support for sure. I mean, in terms of this story, obviously we've got to bear in mind that it is in the Scottish National. What's interesting is how incensed the Scottish people still are about Partygate. One poll in the article found that more than 3/4 of Scots think that Boris Johnson should resign, while just 15% think he should stay. Obviously, he's got a serious problem with the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, and he's going to have to go to Scotland and embark on a strategy of appeasement there. But I think when it comes to taking on the SNP, Boris Johnson has got to go on the offensive. He's got to remind the Scottish people about the SNP's performance on the economy, on COVID, on civil liberties, on education, all those areas where, in my view, at least the SNP has been left wanting. So, obviously it's going to be a very challenging week. Arguably, the Prime Minister would be on more comfortable territory, believe it or not, negotiating and engaging in diplomacy with the situation in Ukraine more than going to Scotland and trying to face the Scottish people and put forward his levelling up agenda to them. But it's going to be a challenging week for him one way or the other. But I do think it's very important that he goes to Scotland and starts to try and rally support there.
I want to quickly try and squeeze in one more story here from the front page of the Financial Times. Shoppers undeterred as big brands raise prices to protect profits from rising costs. This is companies like PepsiCo, McDonald's, Kellogg's. They're all passing on their input costs to us. Very, very quickly, Annabel, how serious is this?
Well, I mean, look, this story is just going to keep running and running. And here we've got these major brands, household brands, that are raising prices to deal with higher labour, shipping and commodity costs. We knew that this was coming down the line. Some people will be cushioned from it, at least in the short term, by pandemic savings, and to a degree will continue to be cushioned by the fact that they're working from home, they're not spending money on commuting or in town centres. But I imagine
the majority who are not working from home will really struggle. I'm so sorry to have to cut you off.